Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Shutdown showdowns are no longer rare events, and law enforcement leaders say that recurring uncertainty creates real risks for public safety agencies that rely on continuity and trust. The National Police Association is throwing its support behind the Eliminate Shutdowns Act as a way to break that cycle. Joining me to discuss why predictability matters so much for policing and public safety operations is spokesperson for the National Police Association, Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith. Sergeant Smith, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
So great to be with you.
The National Police Association is supporting the Eliminate Shutdowns Act that was introduced by Senator Wyden of Wisconsin, arguing that government shutdowns put public safety at risk. So from a law enforcement perspective, what actually happens on the ground when the federal government shuts down?
Well, I think this is something that most people don't take a look at because they think a federal shutdown only affects federal employees and federal operations. But what happens very often is that state and local law enforcement have to step in to assist their federal partners who, may not have enough staffing. The TSA is a great example of that. We also have to look at the funding of the DHS. And when DHS isn't fully operational because it's not fully funded, then the local, state, county law enforcement officer is on the front lines of that war on terror right here in the United States, as we have been seeing in the last month.
Let's follow that thread for a minute. As we're in current combat operations in the Middle East, are you seeing increased threats that have local police forces worried?
Absolutely. We saw that the Austin, Texas Police Department had to respond to a terrorist-involved shooting and eliminate that shooter. We've seen multiple other situations in Michigan and I believe North Carolina. And this is something that local law enforcement, we've had a heightened alert since 9/11/01 anyway. And we're kind of back to that 9/12/01 mentality, if you will, where we have got to really be those frontline boots on the ground in the war against terror here in the United States. Because again, we have to remember that 5 years ago, our borders were thrown wide open. We have literally millions of people here in the United States that remain unidentified. We don't know who they are. We don't know who they are affiliated with. And there is terror cell after terror cell around this nation. And when federal law enforcement operations are interrupted, that endangers everyone.
Let's talk a little bit more about the impacts of the DHS shutdown. DHS has responsibility to provide warnings about cyber threats, about other sorts of physical threats and terror attacks. What are you seeing as a result of perhaps the reduction in that capacity during shutdown?
Well, I've got to say that federal law enforcement is very bravely continuing to do their job despite this government shutdown. But it is very difficult from an investigatory standpoint to continue to put resources on the ground when you are dealing with things like, cyber investigations, terror cell investigations. And we are seeing that when law enforcement operations are politicized, they are interrupted. And federal law enforcement is already stretched very thin, as is state and local law enforcement. And so when you have a lack of resources, you have a thinning of resources, then again, that makes everyone less safe. Let's not forget that because of what we saw in 2020 and beyond, this literal war on cops and the vilification of the American law enforcement officer, you saw a lot of people leave this profession. So when we look at our law enforcement agencies, 9 out of every 10 police departments are still short-staffed. And while the numbers are slowly increasing, state, local, and federal as well, we're still a long way from where we need to be fully staffed, fully operational.
I'm speaking with Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith. She is the spokesperson for the National Police Association. So, Betsy, shutdowns are sadly becoming a more recurrent fact of life. Might be one thing if you just had one and you could move on from it, but how do local police experience the repeated impact of federal shutdowns? What's breaking? What's missing?
Well, every time the federal government shuts down, that shutdown immediately trickles down to the state and local level. Let's take a look at the TSA right now. What happens because we have these long TSA lines at certain airports around the nation? Those lines end up clogging up traffic, making moving around the airports and the roadways around them very difficult. Who deals with that? It's not the TSA, and it's not, ICE or anyone else that federally that is there to help, that's going to be out directing traffic, trying to help people park and all of that. It's going to be the local law enforcement. And when tensions are high and we see people acting out in the airports, again, who deals with that? It's either the local city or county police department, the municipal airport police department. So when you see that the TSA lines, the raising of temperatures and things like that, again, it's the locals who have to deal with that through no fault of their own. And that leads to its own frustration. We also have to look at how local law enforcement are involved with federal law enforcement in various task force situations. And that leads to basically a shutdown of those types of activities. For example, I was on a federally run task force back in the day when it came to narcotics. When the federal law enforcement officers and their funding had to pull out of that task force, of course, that affected not just us, the officers, but it affects that war on drugs, that war on sex trafficking, that war on terrorism, whatever that task force is dealing with. And again, a lot of people don't know that these federal, state, local task forces are a huge part of our law enforcement infrastructure and our success in bringing the crime rate down.
Let's go back to the Eliminate Shutdowns Act for a minute, because critics argue that eliminating shutdowns could reduce Congress's leverage in budget negotiations. The flip side of that, and I'd like you to respond, is the idea that public safety shouldn't be used as leverage in the first place.
Public safety should not be political. This should not be a right or a left issue. And our elected officials, one of their biggest jobs and one of the things that we elect them to do is to keep us, the American people, safe. So what this act would do was just provide automatic continuing appropriations when it comes to public safety issues and nothing else. So we unfortunately, and again, you can go back to 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 years when it comes down to these shutdowns, if this is something that anyone has studied, and you can see that when we go from the past up to the current situation that we're in, public safety has been used more and more by our politicians to sort of squeeze the public and squeeze other politicians to pass appropriation bills, the continuing resolution. And it's obscene, quite frankly. This is I want everybody to think about, the municipality that you live in. What if your city council members and your mayor decided to say, you know what, we're going to shut down the police department until we can agree politically. That's insane. And everybody thinks that's insane. But that's exactly what's happening at the federal level. And it impacts national security and it impacts your security on a local level as well.
I've been speaking with Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith. She's the spokesperson for the National Police Association. Thanks so much for joining me, and thanks for your personal police service.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.